Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name is Walaa Isam, and I am a second-year ME student in Applied Diplomacy at the Grade School. I am very pleased to introduce Walaa Elboushi, who is the former Minister of Youth and Sports in Sudan Transitional Government and the former Chairperson of the East African Advisory Board for the Mandela Washington Fellowship for Young African Leaders. She has several years of experience in both the public and private sectors, as well as in civil society. Minister Elboushi has held appointments as a lecturer in Khartoum and Sudan University, and has founded and led several initiatives in Sudan and across the African continent. She is a mechanical engineer with an MSc and DIC in Advanced Mechanical Engineering from Imperial College London. Welcome, Walaa.
Thank you so much, Tetar. And Walaa, we're so delighted that you're with us today. And before you begin, I just want to remind our audience that there is a Q&A portal at the bottom of your screen, and we welcome any questions that you would like to pose. And at the end of Walaa's talk, I will lift those up for our whole audience. So Walaa, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the introduction. So ladies and gentlemen from around the globe, I'm very pleased and honored to speaking before you today in such an important event, especially at this critical time of our world history, where we all need to sit together around tables and talk. With the Russian-Ukrainian war from one side to conflicts in Nigeria, Yemen, Ethiopia's federal government and the armed forces from the Tigray region, Palestinian and Israel, Haiti, and the list goes on. And of course, my beloved country, Sudan. The world needs the miraculous work of diplomats, or we could witness a world war pretty soon. So thank you very much, Dr. David, the Grade School of Applied Diplomacy and DePaul University for bringing us together from all walks of life. In the past, I used to think of a diplomat as someone who is always look sharp and in a suit, speaks two languages or more, works for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, ambassador to a foreign country or to the United Nations, the African Union, and diplomacy in general at state-to-state level that manages international relations, bilaterally or multilaterally. And I believe most of us think of diplomacy as I used to, until I came across the term everyday diplomacy, and I think you are all aware of by Costas. Then my horizon is broadened to a whole new level of understanding of diplomacy, where he defines diplomacy as a daily activity that could be played by any one of us without paying attention. If you are advocating for a cause, negotiating on behalf of other people, mediating, or so on. In another term, Costas sees diplomacy as a professional skill or a special technique. Actually, this definition makes me quite happy because now I can claim that I'm a well-experienced diplomat, putting in mind my historical background as an activist and then being part of the movement that toppled 30 years of dictatorship in Sudan. So now I can easily say they have a 10 plus or 15 years of experience in diplomacy. Of course, I'm just kidding. Now let's go back to this revolutionized definition of diplomacy and measure its wide spectrum to what has been happening in Sudan since 2019 and up to present. But before that, let's quickly go back together in time and dive in the history of my beloved country, Sudan. Sudan used to be the largest country in Africa and the Middle East until 2009, when South Sudan voted for independence as part of the peace agreement in 2005. Now Sudan is the third largest country in Africa and the Arab region. Sudan shares borders with the Central African Republic to the southwest, Chad to the west, Egypt to the north, Eritrea to the northeast, Ethiopia to the southeast, Libya to the northwest, South Sudan to the south, and the Red Sea. So Sudan is a bridge within the African continent and the Arab League too. Since Sudan independence in 1956 and up to 1989, the military disposed civilian rule for around 4 times. Civilian ruled the country for only 9 years altogether. After every coup, the military dissolved the parliament, suspended the constitution, detained or exiled political parties' leaders, and banned political parties from any activities. Al-Bashir era, which came to power by a military coup in 1989, imposed radical religious laws, oppressed its opponents, detained and tortured politicians, activists. There was extreme human rights violations during that era. Then the US imposed economic sanctions in 1997, and of course, the ugly war in South Sudan, armed conflicts in Darfur, Blue Nile, and Nuba Mountains. Hundreds of thousands were killed and millions were displaced. Then Sudan was added to the SSTL, the list of states sponsoring terrorism by the US government that affected economy, social life, education, health. Yes, this move by the US government was a diplomatic move that aimed to pressure the regime. However, it affected the people more, isolated Sudan from the international community completely. Diplomatic ties were cut with many countries. Of course, during that 30 years of al-Bashir regime, there were many movements and attempts to topple the regime. However, it didn't last for long. Until the 2018 December uprising, which I consider as one of the greatest peaceful movement revolution in our modern history. In 2018, the economic crisis in 2018 spiked. Banks were out of cash. Basic living needs were unaffordable. Demonstrations broke outside the capital, then spread nationwide. They were quickly shifted to the demanding for a complete democratic transition. Economy was not the cause anymore. And this has been the main key that has kept the movement alive until now. For almost 4 years, the protest started small, then kept on becoming bigger and bigger. Regardless of the massive use of force against armless, peaceful protesters, they killed hundreds, but the more we lose a life, the number of those who were out in the street kept on increasing. Until April the 6th, 2019, huge demonstrations of hundreds of thousands managed to break the siege of security forces and national intelligence and reach the military headquarters in Khartoum, where they decided to settle for a continuous sit-in protest until the military toppled al-Bashir and his regime on the 11th of April 2019. This sit-in was like a carnival. The Sudan that we wanted, that embraces diversity, acceptance, and tolerance. Discussions, circles, talks, music, Muslim praying on Friday while Christian protecting them, Christian praying on Sunday while Muslim protecting them. The sit-in lasted until June the 3rd massacre, where hundreds of people, of peaceful protesters were killed in front of the military HQ. After that, the world around us believed that the movement itself was killed, until the massive protest on June the 30th, 2019, when millions of people from all ages and background took the street in Khartoum and most of the 18 states. This was a strong message. Yes, you kill us, but nothing will stop us. After this massive protest, the TMC, the Military Council, and the FFC, the Forces of Freedom and Change, signed the Transitional Constitution document, followed by the formation of the Sovereign Council. Then the government was appointed in September 2019. 20 members of technocrats formed the council of ministers. Among them were 4 women. I was appointed as the youngest female minister in the history of Sudan, the first woman to be appointed as the Minister of Youth and Sports, my colleagues, of whom was the first woman to be appointed as a foreign minister, the first female chief of justice in the region. It was remarkable, and this was the real face of Sudan. We used to be pioneers in the region and the African continent. But as you may all know, democracy is not easy in countries like ours and the region in general. In February 2021, after the signing of the peace agreement, the cabinet was reshuffled. Leaders of the armed groups that signed the agreement and their representative joined the Sovereign Council and the Council of Ministers. And the agreement was based mainly on a power-sharing model. Since then, everything started to fall apart, and the military seized power at the 25th of October, suspended the constitutional document, arrested members of the government and activists. People took down the street immediately, although internet and phone calls were taken down. Since then, every week, thousands of people demonstrated in the streets of Khartoum and across the country, calling for democracy and for the military to stay out of politics. The protest has survived for the past 11 months, and 11 days at the 25th of this month will mark the first anniversary after the latest coup, in spite of the massive abuse of power against peaceful protesters, torture, detention, and the killing. So far, we lost more than 120 martyrs. May their beautiful soul rest in eternal peace. Now let's go back to diplomacy and its role in realizing democracy in Sudan. For example, as an individual, I played different roles during the revolution. I was advocating for the cause in media. I appeared in different TV channels at regional level and international level, both in Arabic and English, as well as radios. The regime at that time was trying to manipulate the public and international opinion by providing misleading information. Also, I sent different letters to international agencies like the African Union. Of course, I was using my social media to be the voice of my people too, and to raise awareness. Moreover, I utilize the network I have built in the African continent and worldwide to advocate with us. In addition to my participation in the protest itself, I was arrested for once at my hometown. Also, I held many discussions and speaking sessions during the sit-in protest, raising the awareness about democracy, inclusion, tolerance, and acceptance alongside other activists. And this is exactly what we mean when we talk about everyday diplomacy, citizen diplomacy, and transprofessional response to challenges. For instance, and on another side, as a female mechanical engineer, I managed to break the preconceived ideas about women in STEM. I was appointed as the first female mechanical engineer in Sudanese sugar factories workshop since its establishment in the 1960s. When I accepted the position, my intention was to advocate for other women, to challenge the traditional look for women professions. I worked in remote areas, in isolated communities, in tough conditions, but I managed to challenge traditions and sexism. I worked as well in the civil society, public sector, and universities. I mentioned this to stress on the fact that skills are transferable and could be utilized in different forms. That's why we are all needed equally to conquer today's challenges, and every one of us could light a candle in a dark room. Now let's go back again to the movement in Sudan. One of my greatest memories during the movement in Sudan back in 2019 when I participated with one of the biggest Sufist groups in Jazeera states in a night that was called the Night of the Fall, referring to the fall of the regime as something that will happen and has to happen regardless. The night was organized in one of the villages with other speakers. I presented a talk about the importance of democracy and the road to topple the regime. After the speeches, we marched literally the whole village around the village for hours. The drums that are used for the religious hymn and the colorful flags of Sufis in front. This scene is exactly what Costas was arguing against international relations scholars who don't consider the work of NGOs, religious missions, and so on as a form of diplomacy. However, just look at the consensus that was built out of that night, the night of the fall, among the population of that village. Isn't it diplomacy at its finest form? Indeed, it is. Let's now talk about diplomatic ties in the form of alliance building among the youth of Sudan, the pillar of the movement. The Sudan uprising was mainly led by the Sudanese youth, who took the streets now for 4 years without losing hope. Young people organized themselves and formed the resistance committees across the country. They invented a new model of peaceful resistance with unconventional hierarchy of horizontal leadership, used different methods of communication among themselves and strategies. These committees were very diverse and included different youth from different educational, ethnic, and economic backgrounds. And all of these factors are what have made this model remarkably unbreakable. These groups faced all kinds of obstacles, but they managed to keep the movement alive for 6 months between 2018 and 2019. And at this time, after the 25th of October 2021 coup, they have kept the movement alive for almost another year in even more extremely dire condition. Also, they managed to organize themselves more, forming alliances across localities, cities, and states, named formal speakers to represent their respective committees in media. Some of them drafted a transitional charter that detailed the resistance committee roadmap to democratic transition. Moreover, we need not to forget the major role that was played by the Sudanese Professional Association in the movement, which is an alliance between doctors, journalists, lawyers, teachers, farmers, and other professions. Also, major political parties together with the civil society formed the FFC, the Forces of Freedom and Change, that were the political face front for the movement, and negotiated the deal with the military council in 2009. Diplomacy and the current crisis in Sudan. The international community was not seriously involved during the uprising until the sit-in protest in 2019, and vigorously involved after the 3rd of June massacre. The negotiation between the Forces of Freedom and Change and the Military Council led to the signing of the constitutional document on the 17th of August 2019. An envoy from the African Union assisted in mediation efforts between the two parties. The United States, Troika, and the EU all played a pivotal role. African leaders, representatives from international communities and NGOs all witnessed the signing of the Constitution Charter for the transitional period. After the 25th of October 2021 coup, one of the biggest challenges that is facing the durability of the movement now is that the civil society, political parties, and the resistance committees, in addition to professional associations and unions, have not managed to form a united front that could seize the power from the military and agree on a very detailed, thorough, and most importantly, practical roadmap to democratic transition. Until this to happen, the movement will be challenged. As I mentioned earlier, since then and up to present, people have taken the streets, tens were killed, detained, economic crisis has worsened, security is becoming a real threat, and the list goes on. Since the coup, multiple mediation efforts nationally and internationally have failed to bring the civilian and the military council together, or for the civilians to form a united front, an alliance. On top of these efforts, the mediation efforts that is led by the UN Integrated Transition Assistance Mission in Sudan, UNITAMS, another initiative by the UN, African Union, and IGAD, that is supported by an initiative that is formed by the United States, United Kingdom, United Arab Emirates, and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And of course, many national initiatives by some religious leaders, intellectuals, and other groups. Diving in the history of Sudan, it's so unfortunate that history is repeating itself with every single detail. There is a very interesting piece that was published back in 1997, 25 years ago, called Preventive Diplomacy, the Case of Sudan by African Center for the Constructive Resolution of Disputes, University of Durban, Westville, South Africa, in the Journal of Humanitarian Assistance. This piece was discussing the conflict, war between the north of Sudan and the south. Allow me to share with you part of that article that says, in order to advance the cause of peace in Sudan, it's important to have a closer look at the manner in which negotiations have been conducted in the past, the attitudes of parties, and the approach adopted by the mediators. A general theme has been for the parties to welcome mediated talks more as a public relations exercise than a genuine means to a settlement. None of the parties wants to be perceived as a warmonger, not interested in peace. And so whenever a third party suggests mediation, the initial response is nearly always positive. But whenever talk starts, it soon becomes obvious that not only are the position of the parties far apart, but even more significantly, that there is no basis for compromise. The explanation is clearly that parties are keen to appear to want peace, to win international sympathy, while realizing that the prospect for a settlement are in fact negligible. Since the parties remain firmly committed to positions that are extremely difficult to bridge. A correlative theme in the various mediation process is that the mediator's objective has largely been to bring the parties together to talk without getting deeply involved in the issues dividing them. The assumption is that once a party begins to talk, they will identify the issue, clarify their positions, and eventually compromise. In reality, the mediators soon find that much of the effort goes into talks about talks, and that once the key issue are raised, the process falls apart. The commitments on both sides emerge as irreconcilable. The mediators remain unwilling to get involved in discussing substantive issues, and the talks inevitably fail. Quote ends. This article was published 25 years ago and could easily be published to describe the current situation in Sudan. From all what is explained earlier, for a peaceful transition of power to save the country from the potential of going into a civil war, which I see it as a highly likely scenario to occur if nothing happens in the near future, is through dialogue. Here, word diplomacy must play a vital role in helping Sudanese to reach a form of public consensus to transition. However, all mediation diplomatic efforts needs to consider certain factors. A grassroots analysis to the real issues that divide the different parties. And for parties, I mean political parties, armed groups, resistance committees, professional associations, and other groups for preventive diplomacy, conflict management, or resolution diplomacy, as in the current case of Sudan. Everyone should pay a close attention to the historic tension among political parties and the grudges they built against one another through time. For instance, when we trace the history of political parties through the history of Sudan, they were very successful in forming coalitions that succeeded in seizing power from the military, but failed big time in keeping those coalitions strong and intact through transitional periods, which led to another military coup or weakened the civilian government. If parties wouldn't keep this in mind, military generals will always find a reason to obstruct the civilian rule. Parties should know that a coalition that lasts for the entire transitional period is a must at this time. They should leave political competition to the future. In the meantime, they should work in reforming their internal structures, bylaws, practicing democracy within them, building their political mission, vision, and their future election campaigns, and so on. For this to be achieved, we need what Dr. Jeffrey Wiseman identified as a polylateral diplomacy, which is practiced among state-sponsored and non-state actors. The non-state actors could be anyone from political parties, academics, activists, or any individual who can advocate for the cause. And from another dimension, one of the major obstacles toward democracy is awareness. Awareness of basic rights. More than half of the population live under poverty line. Many don't know about the basic rights of living a decent life, the right to education, healthcare, clean water, etc. Moreover, for the civil movement to build a common ground in defining the slogan of the revolution, freedom, peace, and justice. For instance, what is freedom? How to respect and tolerate other people's choices. If it's not sorted out, might have a disastrous consequences in the long run, especially after living under a radical regime for 30 years. And therefore, the civil society could play a major role in raising the awareness among the people. Sometimes the civil society focuses more on working with a certain group of people who are well-educated, activists, or politicians for capacity and network building. However, from my point of view, what is really needed is to focus more on those who were not lucky enough to learn about the rights. Thus, if we are heading into election that might vote based on sectarianism and not rights, we need to bring more people on board who understand the true meaning of peace, freedom, and justice, though who could be the seeds for a strong grassroots social change. And again, if linked to diplomacy, there is no better definition than what Dr. Jeffrey Wiseman came with, which is omnilateral diplomacy. According to him, is a diplomacy that is practiced among non-state and grassroots actors without nation states. Another important aspect is the military. Through history, Sudanese army has been radicalized, mainly involved in wars and conflicts against its own people and protecting dictatorships. So far, Sudan had the highest number of coup attempts in Africa, which is 17 attempts. 6 of them were successful. Also, so far in Khartoum, only there are about 7 armed groups. One unified army that believes in democracy, equality, understand that its duty is to protect the country, the people, and the constitution, and to stay away from politics is key to democratic transition. The civil movement needs to be proactive with a detailed logical process that will achieve the security sector reform. Without this, the durability of the movement toward democracy could be jeopardized and will be moving in the vicious cycle of civilian rule followed by a coup. And of course, we need the effort of international diplomacy by imposing sanction on the countries that support the militias and the military coup in Sudan, and some regional countries that have trade ties with militias, especially on gold. In addition to that, here, of course, we need the support of citizens' diplomacy, internally in Sudan and worldwide, on putting pressure on international powers to support the Sudanese on their struggle towards democracy. And here I recall the magnificent role that was played by Sudanese diaspora and our friends around the world when they organized huge marches in Washington, D.C., New York, London, Paris, and other places, which had huge impact on strengthening the support of international community for the revolution. In conclusion, democracy is a process that has its ups and downs. Even for the first world countries, which have established their democracies for decades and built strong institutions, we see their democracy sometimes is tested and shaken. Thus, we should never take democracy for granted. As I mentioned, it's a process that needs efforts, patience, and collaboration. We should work together, learn from one another, experiences, successes, and failures, which are not failures, but lessons. Every one of us could be an ambassador for democracy and diplomacy. The world needs us. Those who have these beliefs, we need to be louder and make sure our voices are heard. We need to build alliances. And as I always say, we just need to communicate with one another to realize that we are so similar, have same fears, hopes, and dreams. But sometimes we just hold ourselves in the superficial differences of race, religion, gender, or even borders that we didn't choose for ourselves. For instance, I didn't have the choice or being consulted to be Sudanese, and neither any one of you. We all could play a pivotal role in our own spaces and communities, at workplace, neighborhood, university, mosque, church, or temple. We are all diplomats without knowing or paying attention, but we could do more by paying more attention. So my advice for our future and young diplomats is to identify and think of yourself as a global human. Think above and beyond race, religion, gender, and even nationality. Build a unique set of morals and value system to hold yourself accountable. Develop a conscious intention in everything you do that will leave a positive impact on us all, the planet, or the environment. Build your communication and leadership skill. The true leader is the one who is able to speak the true mind when it's against the flow. You need the skills of tolerance, elasticity, and the ability of accepting the odds before the norms, empathy, honesty, transparency, and above all, humbleness. Being humble is key in understanding others, to ask for help and for continuous learning. Also, from my own experience, one of the most vital skills is the ability to speak the language of others. And here, I don't, of course, mean we have to learn thousands of languages. I think even Google Translator will fail in achieving that. But I mean you are able to speak in a language that could be understandable by those who are in front of you, whether if they are university professors or a woman or a man who live in an isolated community who are completely illiterate. And those are the ones who should be a top priority for us. During my time in the government, I traveled to 14 states, visited villages, localities, cities, and internal displacement camps. I went to places where I have been told it was their first time to meet a governmental official, or the first time to meet one since the 1970s. I met those people under the trees, youth centers or stadiums, without the formalities of the protocols. Most of the time, build walls between official and the real stakeholders. Finally, let's think of diplomacy beyond suits, ties, and elegant offices. And let's think of diplomacy and collaboration among us, not only out of the box, but without the box itself or any limits. Thank you very much.
Elboushi, thank you so much for such an inspiring talk. You have educated us so much about both the history of Sudan and the modern realities, and what an inspirational talk. And I want to say that your talk has generated a number of fascinating questions, and I would like to pose a few of those to you now, if I may. First comes from Noe Cornago in Bilbao, Spain. He is one of the 3 authors of Transprofessional Diplomacy, working with Kostas and Fiona McConnell. And he asks, I am very impressed by the audacious measures you fostered to build bridges between otherwise separated communities, such as the one you mentioned of mutual protection of Muslim and Christians while they were celebrating their faith, and also your support for female participation in sports beyond their professed faith. Do you feel that as an activist, despite the many risks that you endorsed and obstacles that you encountered, that you were perhaps even more powerful than when you worked as a politician?
I cannot separate both of them. I think being an activist, it's an act for me to be a politician. Actually, I was calling myself a governmental activist. And I think being part of the movement helped me to hold myself accountable. Every time when I was sitting in those meetings in the Council of Ministers, I always reminded myself that I'm the voice of the young Sudanese youth. You know, Sudan is a young nation. 70% of the population are under the age of 35. And I was the only member, my age was below 35. So I always reminded myself that I was part of the movement in every decision, in every law that we were discussing, that I have to be their voice and I have to defend them. So I think it's actually quite interesting. Yeah. I hope that I answered his question.
Oh, I think you have, and I think you've made a good case for why should one have to choose between one title or the other, but better to combine them both, as you obviously did when you were in office. Well, I have another question, and this comes from Mohammed, and he writes, what can we, international, West-based civil society actors do to support the democracy movement in Sudan? I am asking not as a diaspora Sudanese, but more as a Washingtonian young professional.
Thank you very much, Mohammed, for your question. It's a very interesting question. Like already the civil society and the Sudanese diaspora and their friends played like a very supportive role in making our voices heard during the revolution and supporting the movement. But of course, we need more in putting more pressure in the international community, as I mentioned during my speech, like we need for sanctions to take place. Like for instance, the Russian government being supporting the military and the militia in Sudan. So the civil society could advocate maybe for laws to be designed in your respective countries. Also, the civil society in the Western countries, they could build alliances with the civil society back in Sudan. As I said, we need to work with localities and with the general public in raising awareness about rights. And, in order to build more consensus and more understanding about democracy. So the civil society internationally could play a crucial role in putting pressure in your countries, against your government, to support the movement in Sudan, and also to work in collaboration with the civil society back in Khartoum and across the country, of course.
Thank you. I muted. Thank you so much, Walaa. We have another question from the audience, and this comes from Dr. Walaa Elboushi, who writes, "Thank you very much, Walaa, for this excellent lecture. I enjoyed it and learned from it. My question is, if among the purposes of diplomacy is to achieve a national interests and goals in relations with the international community, how can we benefit from diplomacy in relations with the international community in the process of democratic transition?"
Can you elaborate more, David?
So,
like the role of international community.
How can diplomacy, with regards to the international community, help in the process of making a transition to democracy?
Like in the case of Sudan, as I said, diplomacy played a role during the mediation, in the mediation process between the FFC and the military council. And I think diplomacy could play, as I mentioned during my speech, that we need more diplomacy, even to bring the civilians together. As I said, historically, the political parties managed to form coalition, but the moment that the government is into action, they failed to keep those coalition intact. So we need international diplomacy and even national diplomacy to build consensus among the civilians themselves. Now, I think one of the major problems that we are facing now in Sudan, we don't have a united front. Like in 2019, we used to have the FFC, the Forces of Freedom and Change, and the Sudanese Professional Association. People entrusted them to be the face of the movement, but now the trust it's shaken. So it's where diplomacy could play like a major role, in bringing those parties together. So without this, I don't think the movement will move forward. And as I said, Sudan shares borders with 8 countries. Sudan is the bridge between the African continent and the Middle East. I always say that sometimes the international community does not consider Sudan and its crucial role in keeping the stability of the region, not only the region, even the international space. When you have a country that shares borders with 8 different countries from Central Africa, West Africa, East Africa, Red Sea, Northern Africa, if you have a failed state, then everything will be jeopardized from Egypt and up across the Red Sea. That's why we need the international community to know that the stability of Sudan is very crucial in stabilizing the region in Africa and beyond. And here, diplomacy could play like a major role.
Thank you so much for that. Well, speaking of things that are destabilized, as you are well aware in this conference, we've considered the fact that democracy is eroding in different parts of the world right now, unfortunately, not only in one. And with that theme in mind, a question comes from the audience that says, what message should be taken from Sudan's democracy experiment by folks in established democracies like the United States?
As I said, you should never take democracy for granted. You know, you don't think that you have these well-established institutes and that you have your laws, you have a military that supports the constitution. Democracy is a continuous process. That's why we saw that democracy has been shaking in the United States in the previous years. And also I visited the United States 3 times in 2016, 2018, and 2019. And I was very lucky to visit like different communities, like the Latinos communities. And also I went and visited the Hopi tribe, like the oldest native tribe in the United States. And I was shocked that they live in a very isolated community. I was shocked. I didn't expect that I can find like a US citizen lives in such like unfortunate situation. That's why democracy should be practiced everywhere. And we should keep on educating people on democracy rights and not take it for granted. And also we need to work even with children from an early age, like to educate them about tolerance, acceptance, equality, to think beyond race, beyond color, beyond religion. So as I said, democracy is not only about institutions. It's a practice, an everyday practice.
Indeed. Well, we have one more question from the audience I want to share as our time has just about run out. And this question says, you spoke of the need to bring more people on board in a movement to counter the current regime in Sudan. What has been the most effective message that has served to inspire the most people who otherwise have not participated in this movement before?
The slogan of the revolution itself, as I said, freedom, peace, and justice. We need to talk more about identifying what is freedom, what is peace, what is justice. The more that you bring consensus about the slogan itself, I believe that the more you bring people on board. And I always say that also we need to consider everyone. Sometimes we who live in big cities, we forget about those who live in displacement camps. Like during my time, during the government, I remember I went to one of the internal displacement camps, and they were telling me that women, they didn't have an access to safe delivery. They didn't have an access to clean water. We need to reach those people and let them feel that we need democracy to make sure that their life will be better, and also to hold ourselves accountable. It's not only about preaching the people about and to give them the hope that their life will be like, you know, dreamy and rosy in just seconds. No, it's a process. They need to be patient, and the more that you talk to people, the more that you bring people on board. And also, we lost so many lives. I think now all the Sudanese people know that blood have been shed, and that in order to pay back to those who lost their lives, we need to move on, because and at the end of the day, without democracy, we will never see peace in Sudan.
Walaa Elboushi, I want to thank you so much for what you've shared with us today, for your courage and tenacity, and for all that you represent. And then you are such a marvelous ambassador of your country. And I know that our students and our audience are certainly inspired by what you have to say. And we look forward to continuing to watch what is unfolding in Sudan, inside and outside the country, and in the hope that all of the movements and efforts that you've described will come into fruition once again. So thank you so much, and we look forward to continuing to being in conversation with you.
Definitely. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Walaa. We will return in 20 minutes at 10 minutes to the hour with the final panel of our conference entitled Diplomacy and Democracy on the Ground, the Work of Global Citizen Diplomats. So enjoy a break, and we'll see you at 10 minutes to the hour.